Hello again and welcome to another bearing removal and installation video featuring Boca bearings. Now today's video is going to be an interesting engine to remove and replace bearings in, because it's been a while since I've done a twin cylinder engine bearing removal and replacement. And that's exactly what I have today. Is I've got my own personal OS FT-240 Super Gemini engine that I've completed a disassembly series video series on, and now it's to the point where I need to remove the bearings in this engine so I can replace them with an upgraded set of Boca bearings. So let's go to the table and I'll talk about some of the challenges that might present themselves and some of the other special things about removing and installing bearings in this twin cylinder engine. Okay, so here on the table I've got the crankcase of this OS FT-240 Super Gemini engine. Now I still have the engine mount on. This is an engine mount that comes with the engine, and I left that on, or I put it back on, because of the fact that I think, because of the size of this crankcase and the fact I'm doing this inside on a small desk vise and not outside on a big wood vise, I wanted to leave the mount on so that I would have room to tap this crankshaft out while sitting on top of my vise. So that's why I have this mount on here, and I'll probably be taking the mount off for the bearing installation portion. But I want to talk about something here real quick, in that this engine has a total of 5 bearings. And let me get out the other cover that I forgot to get out and show you all 5 of these bearings. So first is this rear cover, which goes on the engine like this. This is the bearing for the rear end of the camshaft, or the timing shaft, whatever you want to call it, camshaft. That one will be removing. Then you've got a front bearing, as normally you would have. Then there's a mid bearing that's right about here. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it in there or not, but there is a bearing in there. And then of course, there's a rear main bearing. Now I said that there are 5 bearings, and I've only shown you 4 so far. The 5th bearing, which I will not be replacing, unfortunately, is deep down inside here, which means it resides in this portion of the crankcase. Now, I won't be removing that bearing for several reasons. The first reason is that I have no means to remove that bearing. I don't have a tool that will allow me to reach in there and remove that bearing. The second reason is that that bearing seldom ever really gets too worn out or pitted, rusted, etc. And what I have already done with this bearing to treat that is I went in there and I used some Boca's bearing soak and put some bearing soak in there. No, Clean Touch, the product Clean Touch. It's a solvent, and I went in there and just let it soak, and then I cleaned it all out so that I cleaned that portion out, because I wasn't going to put this whole thing in the ultrasonic cleaner. So I cleaned it all out really well, and then I stood this up like this and fixtured it so that it would stay like this, and then I poured some bearing soak in there. And so that bearing has basically already been cleaned and lubricated already, so there's really no need to replace it, and all of these are very low time bearings to begin with. So there are 5 bearings total in this engine, and unfortunately the kit that I purchased, and we'll talk more specifically about the kit, the Boca bearings kit, when I go to do the reinstallation or the installation of the new bearings. But that kit only comes with 4 of the 5 bearings. It does not include this bearing at all, and I was not able to find any kind of reference that talks about that particular bearing anyway. So what we're going to do here is, there's several things here. The first thing I think I'll do is I'll heat this thing up and get this bearing out, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that, and then we'll work on this crank case here. So for me to get this bearing out, I'm going to have to put my desk vise right here. I'm going to raise this platform up and really pinch it in here tight, because that's going to have to be my firm surface. Now I'm also going to put just a couple of drops of some penetrating oil around this to kind of help facilitate this bearing coming out. So let me get my heat glove on here This is one of those rare instances where I'm going to have to use 2 gloves because I'm going to use my left hand to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat this case up really hot, and then I'm just going to kind of tap this down, keep tapping the cover down until that bearing comes out. So let me get both my gloves on here, and let's get this heated up. And get this bearing out. Alright, hopefully it'll be enough. Oh, there we go. And just like that, that bearing is out. That was pretty easy. I'm pretty sure that bearing is going to be rather warm. Yeah, it is. So I'm going to just set it off to the side here for a moment. So that wasn't as challenging as I was thinking it was going to be. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this platform down. And so to remove the bearings in this crankcase, I'm going to do the same method I always have been doing, which is to tap the crankshaft out. Now there's a lot of mass here, so I'm going to have to really heat this thing up. But I'm also, when I go to do the installation of the bearings, I'm going to be moving to a different location and using my arbor press to install them. I just believe that it's a lot easier to get bearings out by tapping than it is to get them out by pressing. Now I like, in many instances for engines like this, I like to do the pressing installation of the bearings as opposed to the tapping them in. So I'll be tapping them out but pressing them in. So hopefully that bearing is cool enough so I can move it off to the side here. And we'll start heating this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat this up tremendously and really start tapping it down. And I don't think that you're going to be able to see me tapping that with the other camera angle, but that's what's going to happen here. So let me start heating this up. So my biggest concern is this mid bearing coming out on the crankshaft. Alright, let's see if I've got enough heat in that to get this crankshaft out. Oh wow. Okay. Well, let's see how that came out here. It looks like that was rather easy. So we've got bearing here, and we still have the front bearing. So for the moment, I'm going to move this out of the way, and we'll focus on getting this front bearing out of here, which hopefully will not be an issue. But it may require that I take, might actually require that I take this mount off so that I can get in there better, because my punch is rather short and it's not going to give me a lot of room. So I'm going to shut the cameras off here for a second, get this mount taken off, and figure out exactly what tools I need to use to get that front bearing out. Okay, so I've got my plan formulated for how I'm going to get this front bearing out. And what I'm going to use is, I didn't want to have to use this tool. It's just a screwdriver handle, but it's got a socket on there. But this is going to allow me to reach in there and safely tap that bearing out. So it's been a few minutes that I've been formulating this plan, so I'm probably going to heat this up just a hair more to help me get that out, and then we'll move on to getting these last 2 bearings off the crankshaft. Hopefully that'll be enough to get this front bearing out. Should just be a matter of our standard tapping. Yeah, I didn't even need to get that all that warm to do that. So there we have it. That bearing, that front bearing is out. Feels pretty nice too. So that bearing is taken care of. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to end up just hand cleaning this by hand instead, because I've already cleaned this bearing up in here. But we'll see. We'll see what I'm going to do here. Now I can at least show you that bearing. That's a little, you can see in here, you can see that bearing right in there. There's got to be there's just not a tool that I have available that will allow me to get in there and pull that out. But like I said, I don't have a replacement bearing anyway, because this bearing wasn't included in the Boca kit. So let's look at this now. Here's our crankshaft. Here's our rear bearing, and it's got this collar around it. And then of course here's our mid bearing. So what I was going to do with this is I've got this new type of little gear puller, bearing puller, gear puller, whatever you want to call it. And I've got it set up, but what I think it's going to do is I think it's going to probably pull this little aluminum collar off first. So I'm just going to get this thing set up on here to pull this off. I don't know that it's going to pull the bearing off. I may just get this front collar off first, because it looks like it's only grabbing that collar. So I may have to, it may be an incremental thing where I take that collar off and then go and take the bearing off. So that's what I thought was going to happen. So that collar comes off, and now this, it actually looks like I'm going to have to take this timing. There's a gear on here that I'm going to have to take off, and I've never had to do that before. So I'm going to have to fixture up, see how tight this thing is, and fixture this up, because this is just not going to come off like that, because this bearing is attached to the crankshaft like this, which also means that there's a timing mark that's going to have to be adhered to. So this one's going to take me a little bit of time to. In other twin cylinder engines, smaller twin cylinder engines, I've never encountered this. This timing wheel was actually the same size or slightly smaller than the inner race, and the bearing would just come right out. This one is not. So now I have to do a little bit more research here and make sure that when I take this thing off, this timing wheel off, that it's either keyed or something, because there's definitely a timing mark on here. It's right here. It's at top dead center, I believe. These things are timed at top dead center, so this mark has to be basically in line here. So I'm going to have to pause the video again here and do a little bit of studying to figure out exactly how I can get that thing off and make sure that I do that properly. Okay, so I figured out what I need to do here with this crankshaft to get this rear bearing off. But so this is going to be interesting. So this is a reverse thread nut that I just discovered. So I'm going to take this off, unscrew this thing, take this washer off that acts as a spacer, and now I have every. Okay, cool. It is keyed. So there's a Woodruff key in there, and I'm hoping that it's just a flat key, and that when I extract this bearing off, all of this stuff will just come right off. I'll know pretty much right away. I believe it was just this washer and nut that were holding it, and screw bolt that were holding this in place. So I'm going to put this back on here, my extraction tool, and we'll get this bearing off. And fortunately, I had put marks on my crankshaft for where that timing mark was, but since they've got a nice there we go. There's our bearing and our timing shaft with the little bitty Woodruff key in there. I gotta make very sure that I don't lose that. So I'm going to place these small items here for now. Actually, I think I want to put them in a small bag. I just so happen to have a Boca bag here that I'm going to drop these parts into, just to make sure I don't lose them. Because the next portion of getting this front bearing off, I was hoping that I could use a puller, but because of the length of this crankshaft, I'm not going to be able to do it, so I'm going to have to go back to my standard means of tapping it off like that. So I think what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put a little bit of oil on this thing and clean this shaft up just a little bit first to help make this a little bit easier. So I've just got a little bit of piece of 400 grit cloth sandpaper here, and I'm just going to clean that up a little bit there, and hopefully that'll be enough to let me just tap this bearing off in the standard or old means, where I just kind of do something like this. Now I just got to find out where I put my hammer, and there we go. So there, wow. This was, it's been a while since I've done a twin cylinder engine, and like I said, I've never done a 240 like this, and that's the first time I've seen that kind of a timing setup here, because even on the FF, the flat 4-cylinder 320 and 240s that I've done, I've never had that issue or had that setup where there was a gear here that was held in place with a screw, because this is very similar to what you would find on the single cylinder OS FS90, where you have that rear bearing and the cam timing shaft is actually held in place with a reverse thread bolt or screw. In fact, in that one it's got a slot. This was a bolt head. So here are the 4 bearings that came out of this engine, and like I said before, there are a total of 5. But this one's not going to get removed because I just don't have the means to do that, nor do I have a replacement bearing, and I've already cleaned that bearing up. So that was a lot. There was a lot involved in actually removing the bearings on this engine, a lot more than I anticipated, because of the fact that, you know, I've done numerous twins before, but never one that had this particular means of construction. So anyway, let me go and get these parts cleaned up. I'm going to do a hand cleaning of the crankcase, and we'll get all set up in the other room for doing the bearing installation. Okay, I'm back here. I've got all the parts ready for the part 2 of this, which is the bearing installation. I've got my beautiful crankcase all cleaned up and ready to accept bearings, and of course this incredibly beautiful machined crankshaft. So the other things I've got here are, I've got the rear cover, which is where one of the bearings is going to be pressed into place. I've got this bearing holder, and that's where this one of the rear bearing is going to get pressed in place. And then I also have the drive gear, the screw, and the washer that hold that in place. I'm not going to be installing these at this time. That's something that's going to take place at the end, because there's actually an order of operations that I probably could have followed that would have been a little bit better when it comes to removing this crankshaft, and I'll know in the future for doing this particular engine. The 240 and the 300T are both the same, in that I should have removed that drive gear first with the nut or the bolt holding it in place, and then when I pulled this thing out, the bearing holder would have just come right off with the bearing intact. So I also have my bottle of Boca's Lightning Lube Road Power, which I'm going to be using to lubricate these parts up, an empty jar, and of course my Boca bearings. So this kit number of Boca bearings consists of 4 bearings, and the kit number is ENK-086. So let's open this up and take these 4 bearings out of here. Move that aside. So this small bearing here is the one that's going to be going inside the rear cover. This is the front bearing that goes on the front of the crankcase, front of the crankshaft and crankcase. So seals are going to need to be removed. Shields are going to need to be, one shield will be removed on this and this bearing. This bearing here is the mid bearing. I believe that's what they're calling that, which resides right here. So both the shields are going to get removed on that. And then of course here's the main rear bearing, which comes without any shields intact or installed at all. So the order of operations is going to be here. as far as installation of the bearings is I'm going to take these things out to a firm countertop where my arbor press is. I'll press this bearing in probably first, then we'll start with the crankcase. We'll do the front bearing first and then the crankshaft with the other two bearings installed on it. So I want to go ahead and get all these items lubed up here. So there's my road power, and I'm just going to start liberally applying this lubrication here because I really like using road power for reassembly tasks like this. Now this bearing holder, I'm going to actually press this bearing into the holder first and then put it onto the crankshaft, and I'll show you why here in a few seconds. So all of this stuff in here where these things are going to reside needs to be lubed up really, really well. Okay, that should be good for now. So the reason that this is going to get pressed in there, and I'm going to press this in there, and there's definitely an order of operations that could be followed. I could press that in there and then put it on the crankshaft and then drop the crankshaft in there, but I don't think that's necessary, and I'm going to show you why. Because this is the bearing holder and it's machined so perfectly, it just slides right in place like that. So there's no reason to be pressing that. And I want to show you how easily, did I lubricate the rear end of this? How easily this main bearing just slides right onto this. So there's really nothing to press there. So I'm thinking what I'm going to do is press this bearing into the holder and just leave it sitting there and put these other bearings on there, put the crankshaft in, and when it's in place, then I'll just slide that bearing on there, bring it back in here, and put that timing drive gear on. So with all that said, let me get some shields removed from these bearings. This one's going to get both shields removed, and that'll lubricate the bearings up. Now removing these metal ZZ shields is simple. You just kind of poke in there just above the inner race and lift up. Now on this front bearing, I'm just doing one side. There we go. And the same with this little bitty one here. This little one's really tiny. I'm gonna see if I've got a smaller screwdriver here to use on this one. Okay, there we go. So shields are all removed on our bearings now. So I also want to show how simple and how easy this bearing goes on here. So see how easy these things go right on there. So with that said, what I think I'm also going to do, now it's not necessary, but I think I'm going to do it anyway, is I'm just going to drop this crankshaft with this bearing on there into the freezer. I'm going to lubricate this all up again. I didn't lubricate these bearings. Put it in the freezer just to chill it, and then I'll heat this case up, and maybe, just maybe, we'll get to see if that is enough to just have this whole thing just drop into place with no effort whatsoever. Because if you saw the first segment of this where I tapped that out, it took one tap to get this whole crankshaft out. So maybe it'll only take some cooling of this for about an hour in the freezer and some heating of this to have that thing just drop into place with no effort whatsoever. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to shut the camera off here, move all these parts into where my arbor press is, put this in the freezer for about an hour, and then we'll resume and finish up this bearing installation. Okay, I'm ready to begin the bearing installation here. So I've got my rear cover here, and I've got the small bearing for it right here. I'm going to just start heating this cover up just a little bit. I've got a couple of popsicle sticks here to hold that rear cover flat because it's not completely flat on that side. I don't think this is going to take a whole lot of heat. because it's such a small piece. So we'll see if that's enough. It's a little warm, it's not super hot. So I'm just going to lightly place this bearing in here. Try to get it as square going in there as I can off the bat. And that should be all there is to installing that bearing. It's completely installed. So the next one I'm going to install is I'm going to press this main rear bearing in here, but I think I'm going to use this block here. So once again, I'm just going to heat this up. Everything is oiled still. This little aluminum ring should take heat really well. Hoping I'm doing that in frame. Well, it's not super hot, that's for sure. And there we go. That bearing is in place now. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is move that out of the way. And we're going to see how our alignment is for heating up and installing this front bearing. So I think we're looking pretty good there. Let me do some heating of this crankcase. This crankcase is pretty large, so it could absorb a lot of heat. That's why I'm just directing it really only at the front, where I really need it at this moment. Shielded side facing out. That's why I don't like to press sometimes, is it? I think I'm going to have to finish this up by tapping it in, because my press is moving all around. Maybe I didn't get it hot enough. I may have to just tap this one in place. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move this out of the way and do this. And tap that in place just like that. So now that's in place. That's kind of one of the drawbacks with using a press here like this. So for the main bearing crankshaft installation, I've got a couple of different holes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I drop that crankshaft in here, if it'll fit in there and go in deep enough so that I can just press that whole assembly in just like that. Now I'm not going to be putting the bearing on at this time. I think I'm just going to put the front crankshaft, or the crankshaft with the one mid bearing in there, and then we'll just go about setting this in place. We'll see how that works. So I'm heating this crankcase up, focusing primarily on the mid bearing area, because that's really where the fitment's going to be, because that rear bearing just kind of drops right into place. Alright, let me go grab my crank. And we'll this thing right in here like this, and it looks like that crankshaft dropped right into place. I'm just gonna push, yeah, see, look at that. It would appear that crankcase just, or that crankshaft just dropped right into place like that, so that's a wonderful thing. So now, let's see if we can just drop this into place. Without any fuss. And there. Okay, so now all the bearings are installed, and that was about as easy as it gets, really. Now the only thing that's left for me to do is just put the drive gear on. Okay, so that completes the bearing installation for this beautiful OS FT-240 Super Gemini engine of mine. Now look how beautiful these things spin. I went ahead and off camera just went ahead and installed that timing gear and the reverse thread bolt that holds it on place. Now the only kicker here, the only thing you have to be aware of doing this is that you could easily flip that drive gear over, but you want to just make sure that you've got your timing mark on here facing out so you can see it when you go to time the engine. But other than that, that's really all there is to it. I mean, I say it's really all there is to it. There was quite a bit involved in removing and replacing the bearings on this engine. This was definitely one of the more challenging ones I've done, especially since it was the very first time I'd ever done a 240 or a 300T. I've done 160s, 120s, and they have slightly different design back here. They don't have the bearing holder and a drive gear that actually has to come off to remove the bearing. But other than that, all went well, and now this engine is ready to be reassembled.